Certainly one of the most, if not the most, famous Beatle. Well, reportedly, this is where he lives. Take a look. It's adjacent to Beverly Hills, California. A home built in 1938. The style is French country. And he spent, reportedly, $4 million when he bought it from rocker Courtney Love about 6 months ago. Now, this is also the home where fellow Beatle George Harrison was said to have passed away. The address that was listed on the death certificate in the LA County Coroner's Office did not exist. And news accounts have traced it to this house that McCartney owns here next to Coldwater Canyon near Beverly Hills. 4 bedrooms, a beautiful pool, very private. That's the Los Angeles home. It's a place where Beatle Paul McCartney hangs his hat when he's visiting Los Angeles here near Beverly Hills. Steve Edwards, back to you.
Rod, thank you. By the way, I should say there's a lot of controversy over
about where he died.
Who really owns that house
right.
and where George Harrison died.
Right. Was it Gavin de Becker's house? Well, Rod just said they looked up that house. It didn't exist. And
McCartney's people insist that McCartney does not have a house here, so that's why.
I thought he just bought Courtney Love's.
Well, there's some question about it. I know that was printed somewhere. But,
yeah, it was.
You know, and people don't want you to know, so it's a little vague about all of that. Hey, we are about to unveil a brand new 2003 car.
As his younger brother, he spoke from his home in London just a few hours ago.
We've known he's been ill for a long time. I think everyone has, but we always hoped that there'd be some miracle happen. But he's, like I say, he's such a brave guy and a beautiful man, and we're all going to miss him.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair never met Harrison, but grew up with his music as anyone in the world would have back in the 60s and early 70s. He said the world has lost a man who was a lot more than just a musician.
I think people will be very sad at his death. And I think it's worth pointing out that he wasn't just a great musician and artist, but he did an immense amount for charity as well. And so he will be very, very sadly missed by people right around the world.
In fact, he is the one given credit for launching the first massive ever celebrity fundraiser, the Concert for Bangladesh, in the early 1970s to try to wipe out starvation in that country. Shortly after the news got out, Beatles historian Martin Lewis talked about the legacy George Harrison leaves behind.
A guitar player, he was exemplary. So many musicians talk about how they wanted to have the George Harrison sound. The group The Byrds in America listened to George Harrison's playing and said, we want to be like that. So many guitar players, even today, emulate George Harrison's guitar playing. You listen to his playing from the 60s, it doesn't sound out of date at all. It's as contemporary today as it was then.
What a good point. That Beatles music certainly stands the test of time. George Harrison dies at the age of 58. He leaves behind his wife of more than 20 years, Olivia, and one son, Danny.
And
youngest, the spiritual Beatle, was 58. Dawn Fratangelo, NBC News, London.
Turning now to the war and that he was still battling cancer. Fellow Beatle Paul McCartney said today he saw Harrison a few weeks ago and remembers him as a brave man who was a lot like a little brother.
But I saw him a few weeks ago, and he was full of fun like he always was. He's such a brave lad. To me, he's just my little baby brother. We grew up together, and I knew him in my old hometown, Liverpool.
The former lead guitarist and vocalist for the Beatles reportedly died at the home of a friend. Harrison's family released a statement saying he left this world as he lived in it, conscious of God, fearless of death, and at peace, surrounded by family and friends. George Harrison was 58 years old. He died with his wife and his son at his side.
Well, I tell you what, he lived quite a life most of us will never know.
Indeed.
I bet there is a surge in record sales, because I think there are going to be a lot of people going out to pick up his music to enjoy it.
And the friend was concerned, and she said, oh, no, one of the racing drivers in the Grand Prix, he doesn't like the one that's winning. He's very upset about that. And this, again, is typical.
Important point to make, though, before we end this. With that concert for Bangladesh, he really started the charity concert movement.
You know what, it's almost, Bob Geldof rightly got the knighthood for his work with Live Aid, but George was the pioneer of that. In the 70s, I did a few concerts for Amnesty International, and I had Pete Townsend and Sting involved, and they were very moved that George had done this work. And when I went to them, I said, can we do something? It'll be like what George did. And so he was an inspiration to all the other musicians. I don't think he's had sufficient credit for that. Quite a Renaissance man, a Renaissance man.
Yeah, that's a good point and a good way to end. Martin Lewis, thanks very much. Kenny Lynch, thank you for coming in, joining us from our London Bureau. Nice to have you talking about your friend George Harrison. And Tony, thanks as well. Let's go to the news of the morning. Here's Antonio Mora.
Thank you, Charlie, and good morning to all of you. The battle for the news around the world. The former Beatle has lost his battle with cancer. He died yesterday afternoon at the home of a friend in Los Angeles, surrounded by loved ones. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. George Harrison, who added both rock and roll flash and a touch of the mystic to the band's timeless image, had been battling throat cancer. He was first diagnosed with that in 1998. His wife, Olivia, and 24-year-old son, Danny, were with him when he died. He had developed lung cancer, and then it spread to his brain, sadly, in the last few months. And in fact, the Harrison family has released a statement saying he left this world as he lived in it, conscious of God, fearless of death, at peace, surrounded by family and friends. Fans are mourning his death as well. As soon as they heard the news this morning, they began dropping off flowers, cards, candles at the Beatles Star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in Los Angeles. Family and friends did gather for a small private service last night. No word yet on any public funeral plans. And people here in the Valley remember growing up with the Beatles. The death of George Harrison brings back a lot of incredible memories.
What I remember about George Harrison was that he was all over my sister's walls, and all that came out of her room was George Harrison, and so it was very sad to hear him die, that he had died.
Well, George was a quiet person. He was the quieter Beatle, but I think in retrospect he was a brilliant man in that his writing, the songs that he did write, where the words are beautiful.
As the Beatles die off, as each one of them dies off, I think it's a loss of that mystique that was the Beatles. And so I think as we get down to the last two, they really aren't the Beatles anymore. I mean, so I think he's going to be missed a lot.
Especially, I think, for people maybe in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. That was a time unlike any other in our country when the Beatles came to the United States. In Liverpool, England, the British flag is flying at half-staff this morning at Harrison's home. People are leaving flowers and cards at his gate. He's being remembered as more than just a talented musician. Fans call it a sad day.
I feel just as sad as when John Lennon died, you know. George lived in the shadow of the other two, but in his own right, he was a great songwriter.
George Harrison had a long history with Paul McCartney, and this morning an emotional McCartney reacted to the death of his longtime friend at his home in London.
We grew up together.
Harrison, dead of cancer. He was just 58 years old.
Leah, Buddy Holly died in plane crashes. George is the first of our role models who died of natural causes. The others were taken from us. It's as if this was George's time to leave, and that hurts even more. We talked about cancer in a matter-of-fact way that cancer patients tend to do. We're very sanguine about it. We had both decided. I had had lung surgery a few months before. He had just discovered the lesion in his lung. He was concerned about the surgery. It turned out when they discovered the lesion in his lung, it was too late to do anything about it. We had both agreed that we were not going to let the cancer change our lives, that we were going to continue to live. And he did. He did.
He did, with almost a mystical feeling about going into death. His statement was so nice that he goes fearless into death. George Harrison, as I say, we learned about his death overnight, but he died late yesterday afternoon in a friend's home in Los Angeles, 58 years old. There's one poignant thing going on out in Los Angeles. You know, there are so many stars on that Walk of Fame out in Hollywood, and a few people have just put candles there on the George Harrison star there in Hollywood. Let's get a last look at the weather. Here's Tony Perkins.
All right, Charlie, thank you very much. Before we get to the weather, I want to talk a little bit about what you see behind me, all of the toys from Toys R Us.
All I remember them.
All right, thank you very much, Joan, for joining us. And we do want to say that One of the items here on the Walk of Fame says, "Here comes the sun." Of course, George Harrison was a very prolific songwriter as well as a guitarist. He's being remembered today for his music and also for his spirituality and for his sense of humor. He died here in Los Angeles yesterday at 1:30 in the afternoon at the home of a very close friend. George Harrison was a very private man. His wife and his son were by his side. We don't know yet if there will be a public funeral for George Harrison, but we do know that many fans, including Joan Flint, are celebrating his life today. I'm Sherry Sylvester reporting from Los Angeles. Bill, back to you.
All right, Sherry, thanks much there on the West Coast. George Harrison, arguably one of the most influential musicians of all time. Let's talk with Anthony DeCurtis of Rolling Stone magazine for a look at the influence of Harrison and the Beatles and thereafter. Anthony, good morning. Nice to have you with us today.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
George Harrison, the name comes to mind, and you think of what?
Well, certainly you start thinking about, he was one of the architects of the Beatles sound. He was one of the people that, there's a reason why those songs have lived as long as they have. They each have a very distinct sound. And Harrison, as a guitar player, always played in service to the song, even when he wasn't writing them. He was underestimated by fans often, but never by musicians, a very influential guitar player. And then, of course, you have somebody who made an impact introducing Eastern culture and Eastern music and spirituality to the West, and somebody who did the concert for Bangladesh, which set the template for benefit shows, which continues to this day. So he made a lot of impacts in an unfortunately short life.
Anthony, a couple things on his personal life. Described as the quietest Beatle. He was clearly the youngest Beatle, also by a couple of years, and they say he came from the most stable family background. Have you been able to gauge how that influenced him in his life?
Well, George really was somebody who, he was the youngest Beatle. In fact, Lennon initially didn't want to let him in the band because he was too young.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he thought that his age, he wasn't 15 yet, and of course, Paul was 15, John was 16, and they felt like they wouldn't be able to get girls because George was too innocent looking,
They were in the band to get girls originally anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And,
Sir Paul called him his baby brother, too.
Exactly, and Paul introduced him to John, and Harrison got in on the strength of his playing. John heard him play and said, "Okay, well, all right, well, I guess we'll carry him along." Yeah. So, but that attitude, carried over, and it eventually came to be a little bit frustrating for Harrison.
Yeah, Michael Oku did a great piece on the life of George Harrison this morning, and there was a quote in there that said George Harrison was saying that he never had a career strategy, never plotted out his life as a professional musician. He just wrote songs when he wanted to.
Yes, I mean, at the Harrison really felt that the Beatles was a kind of very chaotic and unsettling situation, and once he got free of it, he decided he was just going to live his life exactly as he wanted to. So he would make records and be public and go out and do interviews, and then he would disappear for long periods. And he never got on the treadmill again. He just would refuse to do that.
We have now lost 50% of the Fab Four. Do you remember back to 1980 and the death of John Lennon?
Absolutely.
And how did Harrison react then?
Harrison was very upset by John's death. In many ways, even though they had a little bit of a contentious relationship at times, George idolized John. And even when there were moments of anger between them, he always respected him. So John's death both upset him from that standpoint, and back in the 60s, George was afraid of violence being executed against the Beatles. He was afraid of the Beatles being assassinated literally, in 1966. So when it actually happened to Lennon, it was just shocking for George on all those levels.
Yeah, Anthony, kind of a difficult question to get inside of the heart and mind of someone else, but how do you believe that spirituality that he led in his life and believed in his life and tried to contribute to others helped him in the final days where he struggled with cancer?
Oh, I think it was essential to his survival, as essential as it was throughout his life. He believed in reincarnation. He believed that all things must pass. He wrote a song called The Art of Dying. The idea that every soul is on a journey to perfection was something that was simply a fact for him. So, he could joke toward the end of his life about the idea that he was approaching death. He has a song on a guy named Jules Holland, a friend of his. It's a song that George co-wrote with his son Donnie and actually performed on. And for the publishing credit, he listed R.I.P. Limited. He was not one to be squeamish about that because he felt that everybody's traveling down the road that he was traveling down. So it was essential to his perspective.
Thanks for sharing, Anthony. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anthony DeCurtis, Rolling Stone magazine, his thoughts looking back on the life of George Harrison and the impact on the Beatles and the rest of society. Have a good weekend, Anthony. Many thanks. As we go to break, again, the life of George Harrison, heard again.
Addressed his illness and how brave really he was.
He was very brave. Even when he was attacked 2 years ago in his home, when he was stabbed in the chest and his lung was collapsed and he thought he was going to die, he got up on the balcony and started saying Hare Krishna. So he's a very spiritual man. He was not afraid of dying.
And when he walked in the room to see you and you were going to treat him, at that point, did he hold out much hope?
George is very different than many people, and they didn't have fear of death. So he felt that life and death were part of the same process. He would often say the cause of illness is health, and the cause of death is birth.
So do you address a patient like that a little differently? I mean, there's only so much you can do when you have cancer, as he did. Are you a little more frank about with him?
I try to be honest with everyone. I think everyone deals better with cancer if they know the risks and benefits and alternatives. And everyone with cancer has certain issues. Some people want to be cured. Some people are in terrible pain and just want to be free of that pain. And if you can take someone who has great pain and take away that pain for however long, whether it's days or weeks or months or years, they're often very, very grateful.
But bottom line, most important message, he was not afraid of this when it came.
No, he wasn't afraid of death.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Lederman, thanks very much for coming in. Appreciate it very much. George Harrison died 58 years old, 4:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 California time, died at the friend of a home in Los Angeles from cancer, which he said was caused by smoking. We'll take a break and come back. Thanks.
Heard around the world. Richard Quest live in Liverpool with more now on the death of a legend. Richard, hello.
Good evening to you. Yes, in the many venues that are the Beatles, from Liverpool to New York, perhaps one of the most important is here, the Abbey Road Studios, where of course they recorded most of their hits and where flowers and tributes have been arriving pretty much all day. Night has now fallen in the British capital. I just want to read to you one or two of the tributes that have been written on the flowers here. Forever in our thoughts for George, something in the way you moved us, thanks. The music, incidentally, coming from two very large speakers that the people at Abbey Road have put out to basically entertain the people who have been coming here. One or two other things on these carnations. A lifetime is so short, a new one can't be bought. Let love sing each other's song, George. More and more tributes are arriving as evening time comes along. This gentleman has just brought these rather pleasant freesias here. So why did you feel the need to come to Abbey Road this evening?
Well, when I grew up, when I was back in the States, my parents were always big into the Beatles in the 60s, and then all through my life I've been listening to Abbey Road, so I feel like it's a part of me.
But you can't even almost have been born when they broke up 31 years ago.
Not at all, not at all, but my parents were big fans, and they turned me into a big fan, and Abbey Road's just kind of a part of me.
Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Really, across this part of London, which is a residential suburb of the city, people have been arriving most of the day to lay flowers, to write messages. We've seen children, in fact there are some just now, some children who really can't even have been a twinkle in their parents' eyes when the Beatles were recording in this building 30 years ago. Richard Quest reporting live from Abbey Road in London.
Good deal, Richard. Thank you. Good memories there, Richard. Many thanks. We asked our viewers online, too, about this. What's your favorite George Harrison song? At this point, Here Comes the Sun with the edge at 39%. You can cast your vote online now at CNN.com, and the AOL keyword there is CNN. What's far today? Hey, Michael.
Bill, good afternoon, good morning to you. And you talk about that music. So much of that music is being played this morning, and I'm sure it will be played throughout the course of the afternoon. Songs by George Harrison and the Beatles. Now, whether he was writing or performing songs of the Beatles or producing motion pictures, which he did for some time after the Beatles broke up, or organizing concerts for Bangladesh, George Harrison clearly touched millions of lives.
Journey to superstardom began in 1943 in Liverpool, England. At age 15, he joined the Quarrymen, a local group founded by John Lennon. His friend Paul McCartney was also a member. The band honed their playing skills in bars from England to Hamburg, Germany. In 1962, with Harrison on lead guitar and Ringo Starr on drums, the band became the Beatles. Lennon and McCartney's influences were Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly, but Harrison loved the country rockabilly sounds of Carl Perkins. Combined, they started making their own music, and Beatlemania was born. In the first week of April 1964, the Beatles had the top 5 best-selling singles in the U.S. and took the country by storm with their appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. They cemented their image as the Fab Four in 1964 with the motion picture comedy musical A Hard Day's Night, and then Help, which featured one of Harrison's first songs, I Need You. Just what you mean to me, I need you. While often dwarfed by the writing team of Lennon and McCartney, Harrison developed into a prolific composer, with protest songs like Taxman and Piggies from the Revolver album. His song Something from Abbey Road became a standard, one of the most recorded songs in history. Speaking words of wisdom, let it be, let it be. The movie Let It Be, which chronicled their breakup, highlighted some of his best work. After the breakup of the Beatles, Harrison launched a solo career with the hit album All Things Must Pass, which spawned the hit My Sweet Lord, a song he was later sued for because of its similarity to the Phil Spector hit He's So Fine. In 1987, Harrison returned to the top of the charts with his album Cloud 9, which featured the #1 hit, Got My Mind Set on You. I got my mind set on you. I got my mind set on you. In the early 1990s, Harrison's health made headlines. A lifelong smoker, he was diagnosed with throat cancer and was successfully treated. Cancer returned in 2001. The former Beatle received treatment for a brain tumor at a hospital in Switzerland. Harrison's work touched the hearts of millions of fans, but for him there was no master plan. He just wanted to make good music.
Most people plan out careers and records and tours like a military campaign. You know, mine's always been haphazard. I just make a record if I feel like, and I don't really, you know, look at it from that point of view as a career.
Something in the way
So many of the people we have talked to this morning, so many people that we would call fans, actually use the word friends. They say that they were friends of George Harrison. It speaks, I think, volumes of how much the music, how deeply it touched them, and how accessible this quiet Beatle was to so many people. You can see just behind me a shrine has been set up in a spot that was originally remembered for John Lennon, but this morning clearly a tribute to George Harrison. A big picture here saying, we love George, and clearly a photograph here showing Ringo Starr and John Lennon, as well as a picture here of the Beatles. So many people have stopped by and paused to reflect in front of this particular memorial. They have left bouquets of roses and long-stemmed flowers, and of course, as you can see, the candles burning. We don't know how long those candles will burn today. Clearly, though, the lives of so many people have been touched by this man, and he will be remembered for a very, very long time indeed. Bill?
We can hear the music in the background, Michael. Thanks. Michael Oku, Central Park West there, Strawberry Fields.
Former Beatle Paul McCartney says he is devastated by the death of Harrison. The two grew up together in Liverpool, and McCartney says he thought of George Harrison as a baby brother.
We just had so many beautiful times together that's what I'm going to remember him by. A lovely guy, he's full of humour, as I say, even when I saw him last time and he was obviously very unwell. He was still cracking jokes like he always was. And he'll be sorely missed. He's a beautiful man, and the world will miss him.
Again, Paul McCartney remembering the life of his friend George Harrison. In a moment here, we're going to go overseas and check in with Richard Quest, who is himself born and raised in Liverpool, and certainly has followed the life and the times of the Beatles. We'll have that for you coming up here. But back to Judy in Washington now. Judy.
Thank you, Bill. We are waiting. In fact, we're told that the White House...
They wait. Harrison would later say being a Beatle was a nightmare. A serious self-taught guitarist, the music was often drowned out by the screams of Beatlemania. In fact, he'd come to be known as the quiet one of the Beatles.
He was the one that was least keen on stardom. He was the one that was least, but at the same time, he was one that was the most self-contained about it. I think a lot of it was to do with a secure family background. All the other three Beatles came from what can be described, I suppose, as broken homes.
In 1966, he married Pattie Boyd. He later went on to write Something, a #1 hit, which allowed him at last to show off his songwriting skills. It was described by Frank Sinatra as the most beautiful love song ever written. One of his main claims to fame during the Beatles' years was his devotion to Eastern philosophy. He persuaded the other band members to travel to India to study with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. It was only when the Beatles broke up in 1970 that he was able to emerge from the shadows of Lennon and McCartney and properly establish himself as a successful songwriter. He was the first of the Beatles to stage a solo world tour, the first to have success as a solo artist, though this huge hit, My Sweet Lord, led to him losing a legal case over claims he'd stolen the music.
What? I warned you.
In the 80s, he turned his hand to film production. Monty Python's Life of Brian, one of the major successes enjoyed by his company, Handmade Films.
Because they had a hell of a time.
He was back in the spotlight in 1987 with the hit single Got My Mind Set on You. The band The Travelling Wilburys, also a successful musical venture, but his public appearances were becoming less and less. He chose instead a reclusive lifestyle, living quietly with his second wife Olivia and their son Danny on a huge country estate in Oxfordshire. It had been quite a journey for this reserved working-class boy from Liverpool, who'd always dreamed of being in a rock and roll band. In his 40-year career, he proved himself a solo artist, a talented songwriter. But George Harrison will always be best remembered simply as one of the Beatles. Nina Nanar, ITN.
The site of the recordings for so many of the Beatles albums, right up until the last one of Abbey Road, was here at these studios. And all afternoon and all evening, they've been playing music out of large loudspeakers as various tributes from people have been coming along. They've been writing on the wall. You know, the Beatles broke up 31 years ago. And in that time, people still come here and write messages on the wall. They have to repaint it every 3 months. I want to just go over here and show you one message that's been written. To the passing of another great legend, George Harrison, written by Dennis and dated today. All you need is love has been written on a card here. George Harrison, all things must pass. And this one for George, something in the way you moved us. Poignant messages. And what perhaps has been most interesting, Judy, is that the people who've been coming here are those who not only weren't born when the Beatles were around, but weren't even a twinkle in their parents' eyes during those days. They say they came here, they wanted to pay their respects to George Harrison, and as you can see perhaps behind me, inside the Abbey Road studios, candles have been lit. There will be many more tributes from across the music world, but probably, Judy, none will be more poignant than those written on this wall, as they have been for the last 30 years.
Richard, how much are the people of Great Britain still fans of the Beatles? I mean, are there still people who will go out and buy their music? We know here in the United States, they're still enormously followed and loved.
You know, the extraordinary thing was just a couple of years ago when the Beatles albums were re-released. They went straight to the top of the charts, one of the largest selling albums of all time. When they found the tapes of the Beatles at the BBC, that also went to the top of the charts. Basically, it was set not just a mood of the 60s. The feeling of the people in Britain is that they set a mood of the nation, not only from the 60s, but through to the 90s. And the extraordinary thing tonight, perhaps, is that people, as I say, who weren't even born when they were around, are paying tribute, Judy.
Extraordinary indeed. Richard Quest, thanks very much. Richard is in London, and now we want to move to Liverpool, of course, which is the home of George Harrison. Diana, I think it's fair to say that the Beatles probably put Liverpool on the map.
That's right. The Beatles are synonymous with Liverpool, and the city today is paying its respects to George Harrison. The city has declared today a day of mourning. The flags are flying at half-mast, and the people have come to sign the books of condolence at various places in the City Hall, and here behind me at the Beatles Museum, the Beatles story. They've come to sign condolences to George Harrison from around the world, both local people and fans from around the world. The creator of the museum, the designer of the museum, told me that he'd been touched by some of the comments that people had made to him, saying that they couldn't believe that George Harrison had died. Even though people had known that he'd been ill for a very long time, it still came as a shock to many people. And indeed, some of the local musicians in Liverpool have been coming down here today to Albert Dock, to the museum, to play George Harrison songs to some of the tourists, some of the fans who've come to sign the book. There's a sense that this is the passing of a very great man here. His name's synonymous with Liverpool. The Cavern Club, which is where the Beatles played their music, perhaps most famous for playing their music here in Liverpool, they've been paying musical tributes to George Harrison today. There's been a series of live bands there today playing George Harrison songs, and George Harrison songs, recorded George Harrison songs as well. People have been bringing flowers to the Cavern Club as by way of tribute to George Harrison. So a day of great sadness and shock here in Liverpool. The city feels that it's poorer for his passing. Judy.
Diana, George Harrison, how much time had he spent in Liverpool in recent years?
Judy, George Harrison hadn't lived in Liverpool for a very long time. He had houses all over the world, in Hawaii, in Switzerland, as well as near London. But nonetheless, he's still remembered as the son of the city. He was given the freedom of the city, as were many of the other Beatles, the other Beatle members. So he's fondly remembered here. He's remembered here as the quiet one, as the one that got on playing his guitar, writing his songs, not taking the limelight. And indeed, many people have told me today that he wouldn't like a big fuss being made at the moment of his passing, and that he would prefer quiet tributes, thoughtful tributes, and that's certainly what seems to be happening here in Liverpool tonight. Judy.
All right, Diana Muriel, who is in Liverpool, as she says, I want to thank you, and also thanks to Richard Quest, who...
It's not for you, babe, I couldn't even find the door.
Developments around the world. Harrison, the former Beatle, died yesterday in Los Angeles after a long battle with cancer. People are paying tribute at sites in England and also in New York at Central Park's Strawberry Field.
Miss, what's your name?
Shelley Joy.
Okay, you're talking live on CNN. Tell us why you're here today. I've seen you singing quite a bit.
To honor George Harrison. He was a gentle person. He was a God-loving soul. He gave up his heart, and he uplifted generations being a part of the Beatles, and at the same time it honors John Lennon. And we need restoration. We need to lift up our hearts and souls and send out love. And it's very sad that he passed, but we have this great music here in New York City that you're hearing, and hopefully the whole world will see that there's also joy and celebration, even though we lost a great Beatle. And that's why I'm here, and I hope everybody cherishes this moment and keeps the love and kindness and sweetness and peace, and open up and lift inside themselves their creative abilities, whether it be business, music, dance, song, anything.
Okay.
That's why.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
I really appreciate your time.
Okay, bye-bye.
Sure, hi. Michael Oku, CNN. How are you?
How are you?
You're talking live on CNN. Why are you here today?
Oh, geez, I've been a big Beatle fan for the longest time. I heard the news in the middle of the night last night while I was at work. And even though I heard about George Harrison having problems with cancer and everything, I didn't really think it was going to get the best of him so suddenly. It came as a really big surprise for me, you know. It was really something, and a very big disappointment, you know. But it's nice to know that there's still at least two of them left.
I really, you know, so many people say that George Harrison was the other Beatle. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I don't know about being the other Beatle. I always known him more as being the quiet Beatle more than anything else. You know, it's like everybody had their own opinions and their own little things to say, you know, for each other and about each other.
Okay, thank you so much.